you for joining us. It's great that you could be here. So, shall we start then? Can I ask you a general question? What do we mean in this country, or what do we mean generally by food security?
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you for inviting me, both Tony and Francis. Generally, when we talk about food security, it's a very broad term, but it essentially means a reliable access to sufficient, affordable, nutritious food. And that's a fairly simple definition. So everyone in the country should have sufficient food to enable them to thrive and to, well, essentially to survive, but also to thrive. I mean, we don't do too badly in this country, except, of course, it's not fairly distributed and not everybody can afford food. So once you start looking at it, it's quite a contentious. That's the essential definition. If we looked at the World Bank definition, it's fairly similar. It's about the availability of food, the accessibility of food, how well it's utilized, and the stability of that supply. And I think it's the stability of supply that's actually concerning people at the moment. It's one of the factors in the report today.
Would you say because of the supply situation, our food system suffers from frailty, or are you fairly confident that it's fairly robust?
Again, another good question. We saw during COVID that the supply of food can bounce back quite quickly, but that did rely quite heavily on us importing food from other countries. We saw during COVID, obviously right at the start, we had problems with availability of food, people hoarding, but the system did within 2 or 3 weeks go back to ensuring, well, food on the shelves. But I think that actually hides quite a lot of frailties in the system. We rely very heavily at the moment on imported food, not just for basics, but also luxury foods, if you like, and a taste for more exotic food that's grown in the last 20 or 30 years. So we had actually got to the point after the Second World War where 70% of the food we ate came from this country. But I think over the last 10 years, that's gone back again to being about 50-50. We're not quite got to the pre-Second World War levels where 70% of our food was imported.
Well,
so that heavy reliance in itself gives us a fragility. But there's also fragility in there because essentially there's an awful lot of cost in the system. And if people are working on pretty narrow margins and they get a better market elsewhere, then that will also mean that we're further down the line for that supply of food. And the other main fragility we've got is the system relies heavily on fuel, on petrol. And therefore, if there's a crisis there, you only have to look at what's happened in Spain and Portugal for the last day or so to see that if the electricity goes out or we suddenly can't get liquid gas or we can't get petrol, then actually the food system is in quite a lot of jeopardy as well. And I think that's quite often the hidden bit for people. They forget just how much the food system is industrialized and how much we rely on transportation.
I mean, because food is industrialized and we have a system where we get it quickly from the supplier to the retailer, almost within a day sometimes. Some commentators have expressed even more concern. I mean, Tim Lang, who I think is a professor, I think he's at Exeter, I'm not sure if he hasn't moved.
But City mainly.
Is he City? But he writes a lot about food and is advised the government very often, and he believes that in the next few years we will definitely suffer from food shortages. Do you share that view?
That's interesting. I have discussed this with Tim or heard him speak about it several times. I think there is a risk because we are relying on food being brought in. So if there is a crisis around fuel, as I said, or a crisis around political conflicts, then yes, there is a risk that we could have shortages of particular items. And also because there's a lot of pressure on UK agriculture at the moment, and this is also where Tim Lang is coming from, we'll see people exiting agriculture to an even greater extent than they're already doing. And that will put pressure on our food systems as well. I mean,
go on.
The system is balanced away from the farmers to a large extent. So one of the projects I'm working on at the moment, although I haven't got any numbers to give you yet, is actually what it would take to change the system in terms of reducing some of that overhead cost so that the farmers got a better return, and how much you actually need to survive on a farm. I think these are questions because there's a lot of resistance. I suspect some smaller changes could actually have quite a big impact. So I think we need to keep people in farming. That's one risk. And we need to look at the food we're importing, which is the other main risk.
You state it in that way that, small changes could impact on our food system. But of course, some people are arguing that big changes are going to happen because of climate change. Extreme weather particularly will cause floods, will cause drought, will cause sea incursions onto the land, which will affect the agricultural land as well. How do you think climate change will impact on our food security? And do you think we're prepared for that eventuality?
Again, it's interesting being in Portsmouth. They're currently rebuilding the seawall against these eventualities. We're already seeing some problems, aren't we? Because changing weather patterns mean that the crops we traditionally grow in this country, the seasonalities change, but also things get planted when the weather's good, and then we have a freak period of bad weather, or there's been heavy rains all in one go that have drowned crops, or we've had long periods of sunshine. So I think one of the problems we got at the moment is the changing weather patterns and whether the crops we grow are now suited to those different weather patterns. So another thing you find down here in Hampshire and West Sussex is that the wine industry is doing better because we have longer, warmer days and longer, warmer summers. But it's also a vegetable growing area, and some of those vegetables are growing less well. We also have other problems that if we do have rising sea levels, then areas like Lincolnshire, which are one of our prime areas for growing fruits and vegetables and salads, that was essentially, most of that land has been reclaimed from the sea since the Middle Ages. And there's a danger that it will become salinated again. So I think there are dangers from rising sea levels. There's dangers from changing weather patterns. And of course, we've got the problem in this country, if we have to rely on our own fruit and vegetables, then traditionally we have a period in the year where there's not much, this so-called hungry gap that used to exist over past centuries, which at the moment we supplement by bringing fruit and vegetables in. So the other area we've got to think about is, well, do we have the storage capacity? Do we have the capability to actually preserve food? Because whilst there's a understandable and good emphasis on us all eating fresh food, we've only survived as a race really because we could preserve it. And I think we've not spent as much time as we should thinking about how we store and preserve food over longer periods of time. And I think, again, that's something Tim Lang and others are addressing.
Well, you talked about the impact on food production in this country, but we import. It estimates between 40–50% of food we import. And some of that food comes from areas that are going to be even worse affected by climate change than we are. So the problem is much bigger than just our own production, isn't it?
It is. It is. I mean, we're relying quite heavily on Morocco and southern Spain, which already have large temperatures and take a lot of water to irrigate those vast sort of systems for fruit and vegetables in particular. We're importing wheat to some extent, not as much as other countries. I think the key thing is that certain crops are going to be in demand elsewhere in the world as well. So this comes back to then competition and trade deals, which are very much part of the discussion now. It's very difficult to see where the pattern goes. I mean, a more perfect outcome would be that food that's unfairly distributed at the moment gets more fairly distributed. The danger is it becomes a pattern. It becomes the richer countries absorb the foods that are available and other countries lose out. So I think there's a real danger on a global basis that there'll be a fight over certain supplies of food. And that also we may actually end up with a much narrower diet than we have now, but we have a very privileged choice at the moment of what we eat, which we've got quite used to.
I mean, given what you've just said, and given what I said earlier about the Climate Change Committee saying we're not really prepared for climate change in terms of adaptation, how important is it, do you think, we should be planning much more now about the future of our food supply as well as other things like fuel and so on, and the impact on our health, but on food supply, should we be planning better and more effectively now than we're actually doing?
Yes, I think so. Again, it comes back to this question, do we have stores of food? There is, I'm not quite sure ever how accurate this is, but the estimation is we think we've got lots of food in supermarkets and things like that. But in fact, were food to be cut off, that would only feed people for 3-4 days, less than a week. So if we couldn't have that just-in-time supply system, then we've got to have some other form of backup stores. Of course, that needs to be planned because you can't just throw food away when it gets out of date. You have to have some way of circulating that as well. So I think that's one thing we should be planning for. And we should also be concentrating a lot more on food waste and reducing that, because that's some of the, also tied in with the resilience of the country. We could be turning that into a longer storage product, for example, as well as using it to feed people who need to be fed now. I think there does need to be plans. I mean, how just if there was an emergency or a crisis, how are we going to access food in ports? So I think any plans that the government puts in place, any strategy, if the national food strategy is revamped, then we have to think about these things. But at the moment, it's on more on a health-based system. It's on the bit about getting sufficient, affordable and nutritious food. And I think this is probably the problem with the basic definition of food security. I think the World Bank definition that sort of says stability as well, we sometimes miss that out. A lot of our national food strategy is based on that sufficient, affordable, nutritious idea, but we forget about it's got to be stable and long-term as well.
I mean, you mentioned, nationally we have to think about this. We're a local Enfield Climate Action Group. How important is it locally to build resilience as well? Alan Heeks, who I think also writes about food, has argued strongly that there should be local resilience forums set up to tackle the food issue. I know there is in other areas like flooding, for example, but with food there isn't. And he argues that local authorities and the community together, the networks in the community should set up local resilience forums to actually prepare for this at a local level. What's your view on that?
I haven't had so much to do with that, but it makes sense, doesn't it? Because if logistics break down across the country, you're going to have to be in a position to negotiate, or having backup stores. You're going to have a plan of who's going to be fed and how. In the worst crises, you won't necessarily be able to, a central group won't necessarily be able to decide where different supplies are being going. Now, there's a lot of people who have a lot of expertise actually in the commercial world as well. The logistics of food is very tightly run. So I think local plans, yes, but they have to draw on expertise and how you would link in with the existing supply chains, and that expertise not just from government but from, well, people occasionally like to knock supermarkets, but they do have a lot of expertise in this area of how to store, move around, and provide food. So I think people should be working together. And some authorities are more ahead on this than others. I mean, there's a lot of discussions in Birmingham, for example, that I'm aware of, where they're already discussing these sorts of ideas. So I think, yes, it is important, but you don't want every local authority, starting from scratch. There should be some discussion between as to what, if you like, the best practice is going to be.